Some things can seem so easy, so simple, so straightforward. They can seem so nice. This question can seem so nice. It really can. Which free scrap ships from any time place would you wish to have seen preserved? It's so easy. It's free ships, right? That's all we're asking for. Free ships. Well, it's kind of like the adverts I keep seeing for whiskey futures. Yes, I keep seeing adverts going, this is the safest thing to invest in. Invest in barrels of whiskey. That will be your future income. You know, that's future guaranteed. That's guaranteed to increase. It's a physical product. It's something you can physically invest in. The trouble for those adverts is I actually know people and have family members who work in distilleries and who run distilleries. And the thing you learn very quickly when you hear them talking on a regular basis is that there is no such thing as that guaranteed joy at the end of the tunnel when you're dealing with whiskey. Because whiskey needs to be carefully nurtured. Whiskey needs to be just the right barrels, just the right temperature. And even then you lose whiskey to you lose it to the angel share, you lose whiskey to barrels which looked perfectly fine, which all the other barrels in the batch were fine, but that for some reason barrel decides to go off. There's all sorts of problems. So basically, the only time you make any money is when you invest at scale. So yeah, it might sound great. It might sound like a wonderful pitch, but it's really not a good idea. And then there's asking naval historian which free ships should be saved from the scrapyard. We're talking about a person who quite literally now is surrounded by 5 built and 1 unbuilt Clarkes. And in this room alone still has 40 boxes of books to unbox. And another about the same upstairs where there's another Clarkes. It's just, there are a lot of books here. I love naval history. So, the first criteria I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to implement something about this which is not going to make it personal. Because if it's personal, you all know the figure. You all know what I'll be making it for. So, I've got a top 15 here to run through, and I'm going to pick 3 from them. But Dreadnought's not going to be in them. The reason Dreadnought's going to be in them is as interesting as she is, as unique as she is as the first of her type of battleship. The only really cool part of her story is running over a submarine, which is cool, let's be honest. How many battleships have sunk submarines? It's a way to go for a submarine crew, definitely, but it's also a way for the battleship to do its job. But the point is, she doesn't really tell enough history. And the criteria I've got to have is it's got to be something that's going to tell the history and get more people into history. And the trouble is with Dreadnought is she is literally around for the naval race, a little bit on the naval race, and that's it. And the World War One, and then she's gone. And she doesn't even get to be in Jutland. So that's a bit of a problem for her. Although saying that, she might be useful. The sheer amount of people who have some really strange ideas about a naval race, she could be used to discuss. She could be used to change the ideas of. I was talking with some students not from the UK the other day. I was guest visiting. By online means a university in another country, and that's one of the reasons why I look a bit tired probably today, is because I've actually been doing, instead of having my usual evenings off where I've been resting and reading and enjoying myself, I've been actually working and teaching late at night with some universities. Um, Always fun. And I asked them, when did the Anglo-German naval race begin? When did the battleship naval race begin? And the number of them who said 1905 in HMS Dreadnought. And that's wrong. You can trace it back to the 1880s. It's certainly going in the 1890s. In fact, you could say Dreadnought is not the beginning of the race. She's not even the end of the beginning. She's not even the beginning of the middle. She's the end of the middle of the race, really. It reaches its final sort of phases with her. And yeah, she's as much a part of the tech race going on between Britain, Japan, Italy, and America as she is about the Anglo-German naval race. In fact, I'd say even more so, because let's be honest, the Germans never pushed the British on the tech front. Not because they couldn't. Please note, I'm not saying that the Germans didn't have the technology. But the Germans didn't have the funding to push the British on the tech front, because the Kaiserliche Marine knew exactly what would happen if they pushed their funding too hard. They would end up in a fight with the army, and they'd lose. The political fights of the army, they would lose. Every single time. So, there's always this upper ceiling onto what they can do, and that's what the Royal Navy just keeps pushing them for. That's arguably what the Queen Elizabeth class are about. Ending the naval race by making battleships so expensive that they can no longer cut things to afford battleships. Because let's be honest, the Germans have to cut their cruiser program. The Germans aren't building cruisers. The Germans build don't really build large destroyers. They are so limited by the fact they are spending so much of their budget building these huge ships. The huge ships they're building, and they're still not able to match the British in terms of numbers. As if you want to look at a video which goes into all that, there's my Building the Fleets of Jutland video, which goes through all of that. All the fact that there is a reason the fleets at Jutland turn up and look the way they do. You have the Royal Navy's Grand Fleet, which is a balanced fleet. And you have the High Seas Fleet, which turns up and... oh yes, it's got headliners, it's got the battleships and battlecruisers. Well, hey, look below that. And that's where it's in serious trouble. And that's why it has to turn away. That's why it has to run. Because if there's ever a fight between the wings of the navies, the Royal Navy's mass... doesn't matter how good the Germans are. As long as you presume the Royal Navy are equally good, which they probably are, because they've had at least as much training at sea as the Germans, probably more so. But, you know, let's consider them of equal standing. They outnumber the Germans heavily in light forces. And that's before things like the Harwich Force turn up if you're fighting a general melee. And the Harwich Force might have been pulled in. So Dreadnought is just not going to make the grade. Because she's not involved in any of that. And it comes to something rather similar for Royal Sovereign. You see, Royal Sovereign here is the beginning of the ships which we tend to classify as pre-dreadnoughts, but I prefer to call Royal Sovereigns type battleships, because my view is you cannot classify something by what comes after it. Because they didn't know the dreadnought was coming. They weren't going, we're going to build these ships because we know dreadnought's coming in the future, so we're going to build these ships. They're not. You can classify dreadnoughts, that's fine, because dreadnought's been built. But classifying as pre-dreadnought, there are so many ships which are pre-dreadnought, it doesn't really help. You have ironclads, then you have the Harvey steel ships and all these things. There's all sorts of different options there. But the Royal Sovereigns also lose out on another reason. This is another reason also HMS Dreadnought sort of lose out. It's because there is Macassar in the world. So there is an example of them still around. So as nice it would be to have one, there is one in the world. So they're not going to add anything to the world history. And it's the same with Dreadnought and the USS Texas. Texas is around. She's not the same, no, but she's got a wonderfully compelling story. And she's of a similar enough generation that, and similar enough stylings that, frankly, she does the job. There is a reason why she is quite so high up on the list of ships I would love to visit if I go to America. I keep meaning to plan for, well, I am planning a solo trip to America. I keep meaning to go to America. I'm planning a solo trip to America. And, yeah. Texas is going to be one of the ships I would love to visit. I'm going to have to try and work out how to see Hydra as well on that trip, but let's be honest, that's because she's the last remaining Tribal-class destroyer, and I kind of like those ships. But, yeah, as we've gone on to the subject of Tribals, Battles and Darings, shameless book plug time. Now, all my videos, everything, all my research, all my funding comes from you. Yes, I am a contract lecturer for universities, yes. When a university rings me up and asks me to guest lecture, I go because I'm mercenary and they're willing to pay me money. I'm happy to be there. But I'm not permanent staff, tenure track, whatever you want to call it. Depends on which country you're in any university. So I get no research funding. And whilst I do apply for some of the grants, I don't apply for a lot of them anymore because they come with too many restrictions. And I'm not talking about upholding standards, I'm talking about things like you must only publish in this way, or you must only, you must use this research methodology or that research methodology, and they might not be appropriate, or they might be appropriate, but I'd like to add other things in them. And there's also these days discussions and things with grants over who owns the actual research when it gets done. It used to be fairly obvious it was owned by the researcher who did it. Nowadays, there are sometimes some games are played. So I fund all my work through what I get in royalties from this, which is not a lot. I just had the last royalty statement come in. Let me put it this way: it'll buy a few pizzas, but that's about it. Not bad, nothing to be sniffed at. I'm far better getting that than not getting it, but yeah. The next book should hopefully be coming out soon, and hopefully once I get enough books out, that'll be far more sensible. But, yeah, my research funding is down to all of you. So, the super chats, all those things, the memberships on Patreon, the memberships on this channel, the Ko-fis, all that stuff is how I fund my research, so thank you. And, yeah, it makes a difference. And currently, all that money, of course, is going to buying Calyxes, which I'll explain more again in the end, but yes. That does illustrate the problem, though, the sheer quantity of Calyxes I'm having to buy. So let's start off with the first ship I would love to see preserved. A Quinquereme. A Quinquereme. Yes, I want one. I want more than one. I would like 3 or 4 preserved. There is a reason for this, because I am fed up of the frigating debates over rowers. Okay, so here's the thing. I'm firmly of the view that having more than 3 sets of oars, 3 banks of oars, on a ship is going to cause an absolute nightmare. It's difficult enough with 3, but just about doable with space and water. Getting 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, or 12, or 20, as some ships seem to have, it sounds to me to be absolutely impossible. Absolutely impossible. So my view is, once you start talking about Quinqueremes, etc., you're talking about a ship which has 2 oarsmen for each of the oars, which are the 2 higher ones, and 1 for the lower one. That would make sense. Two people pulling an oar together. It's a very simple idea. But that's actually a massive debate. Now, to actually solve this argument, we would need more than one. We would need at least our own one. Now, whilst we do know their own ones are sort of based on the Carthaginian ships, we probably also would need a Carthaginian one. We'd want one from probably the Egyptians as well, as they sort of have these vessels. And yeah, we'd probably need one from somewhere in Greece as well. We would need ships from around the Mediterranean, so that we could go, look, they're all doing pretty much the same thing, because there is really only one sensible way to do this. And the historians who thought, in the Victorian times, who thought that you could actually put 20 people rowing with 20 different oars on a ship, were absolutely nuts. I don't see any other way you're going to stick that, or you're going to put that down. I really don't. I'd love to, but I don't see it happening. So, yeah. I'd love some of these to be around. Then we have Zheng He's treasure fleet, the treasure ships, the Chinese treasure ships. And this is interesting style of debate. There are lots of debates about how big the ships were. They could have been 100 meters, they could have been 17 meters long. And there are all sorts of discussions about whether they had 4 masts or how many masts they had. And there are various views of whether they are made on the same style as a modern Chinese junk, or whether they were actually some sort of different, improved structure, or structure which made sense for making them so big. Because the junk works at its size, but it's not necessarily scalable. If we consider that the first voyage is credited as having 62 ships crewed by 27,800 personnel, 800. That's a huge number per ship. That is a huge number per ship. That is roughly 450 per ship, which is a similar number to what you get on a 4th rate, 5th rate from the Age of Sail, a ship of line, or a large frigate. You get 650 odd on a 3rd rate. So you're not talking that far off. And the thing is, these voyages grow. They do grow. And then there are debates about how many other ships they have with them. Whether they have 250 ships or 300 or other ships, etc. With them, or whether they are a total fleet of 250 ships. And there's all sorts of pieces of history about these treasure fleets that we just don't know. And it can only be solved by us actually having an example of one. Actually having one in service. And what's really interesting is where these ships get to. They get to Africa. We're fairly certain they get to Africa. Which was not a small undertaking at the time. It's not an easy journey. Yes, it's not the South Atlantic, but there again, few ships should actually probably go into the South Atlantic even today. But it's not an easy journey. And they get there. And they show off the Chinese power. Yes, it's maybe not all the ships. I doubt all 250 make it down there, but, you know, they get there. And that's one of the reasons why they're the product of such debate, realistically, because they do all these amazing things, so they need to be on the bigger end of ships. But it's working out exactly how big that bigger end is. And this is one of the joys of when you get into history, is they have the measurement of the zhang. Now, the zhang is also an interesting thing, because in some parts of China, it has a length of closer to 3 meters. In some parts of China, it has a length of closer to 1.5 meters, historically. Today, it's kind of standardized, but yeah. The point is, that means we honestly have no idea how long they really were. We have lots of conjecture, and we've lots of attempts to build equivalents of them, and there's even a replica which is sort of been under construction in Nanjing for a while. I'm not sure if it's actually open yet. I hope it is. I hope it is finished by now, because it was supposed to be completed for the 2008 Olympic Games, and I know it wasn't, but I keep hearing different things from people. So yeah, one of those surviving would be really useful. Then we have turtle ships. Now, there are no shortage of replicas. There have been lots of replicas built to them, because, let's be honest, it's the story of Admiral Yi Sun-sin, who is one of Korea's greatest heroes, and yeah, there are lots of TV companies, lots of movie companies interested in producing such replicas, and then preventing other TV companies from having access to such replicas. So let's give them to a museum who won't let them go put it in the water. And so this next time the person comes along and goes, I have to build another one myself. And it's almost a small cottage industry going in constructing these ships. But here's the thing. There are huge debates, not about their size and length realistically, but about how much iron was used in their construction. Whether they had iron plates or just iron spikes on their roof. Whether some of them had the iron plates, whether some didn't. Whether some had iron plates over certain parts of the roof. Let's be honest, there's areas which are more at risk than others. And wood that was painted to look like iron on other parts. Wouldn't be an option. Now, if we consider the battles these were involved in, the history of Korea they were involved in, they're important ships. They allowed them to fight off the Japanese. They allowed them to fight off lots of people for a long time. And if they are really an early version of an ironclad, that is something we really want to have proven, because it's a really interesting development. It changes a lot of our understanding of ironclad history in some regards, because it shows that longer term needs for armouring on ships and survivability on ships. But we just don't have one. They were built when they were needed, and they weren't really maintained. One of the reasons you could argue they weren't maintained that well was because, frankly, the Korean government, especially the monarchy, was not necessarily the biggest fan of Yi Sun-sin, because they saw him as a threat to their own position. And so, yeah, navies were a bit of a problem. That's putting it mildly. But yeah, but we don't have this preserved. We just have these accounts. It's kind of like the treasure ships again. We have these accounts. And the trouble is with written accounts is they can be interpreted. Because people like to write with words which are imagery. And one person's might be a very exacting imagery. They might write very precise imagery. Some might write it more creatively. They might be writing more about the emotion or the feelings it inspires in them. Or they might not care about some sort of detail. They just, it's got iron on the roof. That's amazing. And we're going, well, is that iron spikes or is that an actual iron roof? Come on, which is it? They don't care. It's got iron on the roof. That's all they cared about to mention. They won a wonderful battle. And internally, mentally, the historian is screaming, "Give me one more line! Please explain what you're thinking!" And there's nothing we can do, because they were several hundred years ago, so they are definitely well beyond throttling range. Don't take this the wrong way, but if any historian tries to tell you they never read anything written by someone from the past and don't have a deep-seated desire at certain points to go back in time and murder that person with something like a frying pan or a sledgehammer because they just don't ever explain their points, then they are a far, far nicer soul than should be really involved in history. They might actually believe people are saying the truth when they're talking rather than going and verifying it. Because people always are saying the truth, but it's their perspective on the truth. And so you need to try and verify that and couch that and see what other people's perspectives are and try and find out what the actual truth is. That's why we go and do all the research we do. And that leads me to the next ship. Now, I'm not saying I have any real sort of massive connection with my Scottish ancestry. My family, Scottish and Cornwall, you know. I'm not saying this particular thing led to me including this ship on this list. But the Great Michael is kind of important. You see, it's the ship which kicks off the changing in European naval history and naval technology from cogs, carracks, and those sort of things to ships of the line. It starts a naval race with the English. The Scots build it as their flagship. The Scots then fight some land battles with the English, get captured and killed, including their king. Life happens. Always be careful and make sure you pay the better soldiers in your area. If you don't pay them, they might not turn up to fight. But even then, the English did seriously outnumber and outmass the Scots' force, because the Scots were largely a raiding force, and the English were an actual proper army for that particular battle. And so they sold it to the French. Now, it could well have taken part in the operation which led to Mary Rose going down because of the French attack on the English ports. But there is also the very likely chance that because she couldn't be docked inside the French naval port, because they didn't have the space for her to take her depth, etc., she had to be docked in a commercialish port, a little bit away, and basically falls apart over time because of lack of maintenance and lack of care. And that's gonna happen. Let's be honest, this is not a new story when we're talking about French shipyards. They might on a map look close together, but often there are some significant geographical features between them, so much so that the easiest way to get between them is to go by ship. And how often are you going to travel on a ship to go and survey a single ship when you've got hundreds of other ships or dozens of other ships to look after in your own port? You're not going to do it that often. You might have someone local who casts an eye over it and sends you a letter occasionally, but again, how reliable is that going to be? How knowledgeable are they compared to you about what a warship should look like? And honestly, how keen are they on their job? So yeah, she's disappeared, but she was the ship which kicked off the rise of the ships of the line. She was the one which led the English to start looking for frigate-built ships and looking at the Dutch speed vessels and looking at making them bigger. And then you have the great frigates, and then you have that evolving whole ship line system. It all starts off with the Great Michael being built, and the Henry VIII responding with the Great Harry, or the Harry Dew. It's a fun bit of history. And then we get to something which is going to cause me to probably rant. So if you don't mind, I'm going to take some liquid on board before I do so. Okay. The most common battleship ever built was the third rate. And we had an example of a French-built third rate captured by the Royal Navy and maintained by the Royal Navy, and it was still around up until 1949. 75 years ago. I kid you not, the vessel has survived for 149 years. Okay, it's not as old as HMS Victory. I know it's not HMS Agamemnon or HMS Africa, and I would dearly love one of them to have survived. I would dearly love any third rate to survive, but we had one until 1949, when one bright spark of an individual decides that what you're going to do is get rid of this priceless piece of history, but don't worry, we're going to put both a British and a French flag on it as we sink it. I don't know which individual that is. I'm fairly sure by this point they are dead. But I would seriously like to visit their graveyard and scream "why" at their gravestone, because why? There are so many things that could be done with this ship. It could have been probably not set up in Portsmouth, probably not was set up with HMS Victory, although that would be quite nice to see the two of them together, and it would have caused it to be even more interesting as a space to visit. But you could have set up a maritime museum or a naval museum in somewhere else in the UK, maybe in Newcastle or in Liverpool or Glasgow or somewhere like that, and you could have had this ship as its centerpiece. As its centerpiece. And they don't. They get rid of it. And that would have attracted, let's be honest, such a museum with that thing as its centerpiece would have attracted visitors. There would have been dozens, hundreds of visitors. The ship which fought at Trafalgar opposite Victory on the other side, and then was captured at the Battle of Cape Ortegal afterwards. And it's a third rate, and it would have been so beautiful, such a lovely piece of history to preserve. And they didn't. The level of vandalism truly disturbs me. The level of not knowing the value of something. It's something I talk regularly about on this channel because there are some consistent themes when it comes to naval warfare, naval operations, naval history, and investing in navies. Infrastructure, education, all these sort of things. Knowing the value of things rather than just the cost. That's the reality. And the reality of this is, yes, it would have cost money to do all that. It would have cost money. And in 1949, 4 years after World War II, Britain's not exactly wealthy. But its value would have been massive, and what it would have returned in terms of financial investment is also quite massive. You look at the number of visitors each year to HMS Victory. You look at the way that Portsmouth, its economy, let's be honest, if you take away the Navy, it's still got the Gunwharf Quays area, which is quite a thriving retail sector. It's got some commercial areas. But the big draw in terms of income of people coming in to bringing money there is the historical sites. It's the history. And having a French-built, British-captured and operated third rate would A, be such a typical piece of history, it'd be glorious, but also, just think of the people coming to visit it from across the world. It would be such an attraction. Such a very special attraction. Then we have HMS Kakas. Now, this is a personal thing to me, because I'd like a ship to represent the exploration ships. And so many of them didn't survive being exploration ships that, frankly, it gets annoying. You can't really pick them, because these ones had to be ships which were scrapped. But this one has a pretty interesting story. It starts life and serves as a bomb ship. So A, it's a type of ship which isn't preserved anyway. And they're a really cool piece of ship design and ship construction in that era. So something which would be really interesting to have. As nerdy history of engineering historian coming out of me here, it's really cool piece of wooden shipbuilding technology and history. So really cool to have. But this one has an extra story. When it does its Arctic expedition, it has a midshipman Horatio Nelson aboard. And he goes off chasing a polar bear, or is chased by a polar bear. And very nearly, we lose Nelson to a polar bear. And just think of how that would change history. You'd probably have Collingwood in charge of Trafalgar, if you look at the other options. But which Collingwood becomes a question, because it's Nelson and the two Collingwoods who get sent together to go sort out piracy in Caribbean. So it would probably be the two Collingwoods and someone else who go do that. And let's be honest, the Collingwoods are two brilliant candidates. And if they do different things, maybe the elder one doesn't get the illness and die. It's all an interesting bit of history, but this ship would be something so cool to have preserved. And again, where would I want to put it? Well, sticking next to Victory would be lovely, because you'd have two of Nelson's ships there. But honestly, there are some very cool places you could stick around the UK. A smaller ship like this could be put in a small harbour somewhere. In one of the small dry docks. It could have been stored quite happily and nicely. And it would have provided us with a beautiful piece of history to go and look at. And this brings me to the Gloire. Now, why do I want the Gloire? Why would I like her to be preserved? Because honestly, it gives you a sign at times when the French were really reaching for technology. I also think the idea of having her parked in a port somewhere on the other side of the channel from Portsmouth, and being able to start off your morning by looking at the Gloire or looking at HMS Warrior, and then go and look at either what she was a response to or what was the response to her, would be a really, really interesting day to do some history. I also think it would be an important reminder that the French did try and push the technology envelope at several points in naval history design. And it would be a very cool ship to have. It would be something which would give us a very interesting view. Now, I have to say, I was tempted to say monitors, etc., but again, the monitors I'd once saved were mostly ones lost in storms, so they weren't scrapped. That really, the ships which weren't scrapped was the criteria, and I can see it's a good piece of criteria, because it doesn't involve me lifting anything up off the seabed. I'm going to be stretching that a little bit with a certain vessel, but we'll leave that to one side. Gloire was a really important vessel for her period, because it's arguable that she, not Warrior, kicks off the Ironclad age. The thing is, though, Warrior is such a over compensation for her, and the fact the British build Warrior and Black Prince, that they eclipse her completely. Now, I have to say, that is a standard British tactic. If they don't get there first in ship design, they then produce a design which eclipses the other one so much so that people kind of forget the other one exists. That's why when we talk about the defining of the Warrior, of the Ironclads, usually when you're looking for literature, it's Warrior which gets pictured. And it's not just because she survives. It's because she's this ship which really does represent a significant evolution. Whereas Gloire, in many ways, is a sailable version of the batteries built for the Crimean War. That's arguably what she is. She's an evolution, not an evolution. And that's her problem. There's also the fact that she doesn't get... The moment she gets overshadowed, the French, even, to an extent, sort of ignore her. And to an extent, they're almost embarrassed by themselves for that, because they could have done more for her. They had the technology, they had the capability, they could have done more for her, but they didn't. It's history. And it would be really cool to have. Next came HMS Devastation, and I chose her because I wanted something to typify the battleships of this period, which there aren't really any surviving examples of. And she is the first first mastless battleship. Now, I did consider going for a cruiser in this period, but the trouble is, the cruisers are complicated, and it's a very, very complicated story, and you really couldn't get away with just one. That's the thing. I have to admit, some of the earlier ships are probably discounted from this because you can't get away with just one ship. You need multiple. But I wanted to still talk about them because they mattered. Well, it's similar to the cruisers in this period. They matter, but you can't get away with just really one. You need to have a good set of designs. And there are a few cruisers around, not really cruisers around from this period. There are some ships which come from close enough to this period in terms of their design history that they cover for it. But a battleship from this period doesn't really exist. And Devastation would be a cool vessel to have, to show off, for people to have a look around, and the history of what she gets up to. And also, the fact that she's there for so much of the Anglo-German naval race would really help me with making the case that the Anglo-German naval race and the battleship naval race that takes place in the latter part of the 19th century, earlier part of the 20th century, is not just an Anglo-German affair. It's far more complicated than that. She'd be really useful for that. She'd be such a good ship for that one. Then we have HMS Tiger. Have a look around the world. There's not a single battlecruiser surviving. There just isn't. Now, I find that sad. I find that really sad. I have to admit, even if Hood had survived to be scrapped, she still wouldn't be here instead of Tiger. Tiger would still be here because I prefer Tiger as a battlecruiser design. Tiger is far better, in my opinion. I would love to stick Renown here, but history-wise, service-wise, Tiger beats her. Renown's my personal favourite. But as I said before, personal isn't getting into this. I have to be professional. And so, Tiger it is. Tiger is a good ship for this. She has size, she has grace, she has elegance. And there is no battlecruiser surviving. As I said, this is the important point. And I would just love to have her sitting in a harbour somewhere in the UK. I just think she would be a massive draw. Admittedly, she'd have had to survive World War II as well for that to happen, but seeing as she'd probably be assigned to duties that are force multiplication duties, like being the heavy ship in the South Atlantic, hunting down the Graf Spee, so instead of Renown doing that with Ark Royal, and she'd probably might have backed up Force H on occasion. She might have done that. I could see her maybe having been upgraded to 14-inch guns from 13.5s. I could see that happening. Her getting King George V class style twin turrets. But those things would not detract from her overall beauty and her greatness. In fact, they might have done the turret upgrade and may have dropped one of the turrets to put in to launch aircraft. Probably X turret. Probably. That would make sense, but that's a piece of history which we won't really ever know, because she wasn't chosen to be preserved. They instead preserved other ships as gunnery ships and didn't keep her around. She survived surprisingly a long time. I mean, the British take their time to scrap her as much as they can. She is in commission until 1931, and she's sold for scrap in February 1932, but isn't actually scrapped until about 1935. That seems to be when she actually starts scrapping properly. They basically, she sold to Fawcett W. Ward of Inverkeithing for breaking up in 1932, and she seems to still around in pretty much intact form for about 3 years. Life could be worse. Life could be worse. She was a good ship at keeping the Royal Navy's cruiser squadron up to strength in the late 1920s and early 1930s when Hood, Renown, or Repulse needed refits. And that's the other thing. She would have been, if she'd been kept around, she would have allowed the Royal Navy to refit their battle cruisers faster, because they'd have had more coverage for them prior to World War II. That was one of the reasons why Hood and why Repulse weren't refitted prior to World War II, is that there wasn't coverage. You couldn't afford to drop down below 2 vessels available. So you could only have Renown going at one time. They had the yard space. They had the yard space to do the refit work, etc. They just couldn't do it. So, yeah. She'd be... There's part of me which would like to keep her around for the history. There's part of me would like to keep her around for the change in historical scenarios. But I think she would be a wonderful ship to have around. And as we're talking about ships of this generation, I decided this video goes out at a point at which Drac is... How do I put this? Going to be well enough, happy enough, and able to drive enough that I could see him very shortly after if I did include Warspite in this list. And while she still might not make the final 3, she does deserve to be in the final 15. Because let's be honest, she is one heck of a survivor. And she has such a story in her history. And she even picked out where she wanted to be preserved. She picked Prussia Cove. In the Mounts Bay. In Cornwall. Yeah, not far from Penzance. It's a nice train line straight from Penzance to London, so very easy for visitors to get to her. There's the lovely St Michael's Mount. It's beautiful weather most of the year. Quite a lot of houses there have palm trees in their gardens. It's wonderful weather most of the year. It's great views. There's plenty of ice cream supplies. She picked out where she wanted to be. They then didn't listen to her and broke her up in situ. But that's just cruelty by, the British government. She told them where she wanted to be. She said, I want to be preserved, I want to be here. And the best way she knew how. And just think of that. It would have turned that part of the UK into an absolute mecca for tourism. As well as an absolute mecca for historical discussion, debate, and wandering around it. Admittedly, I would probably have been joining Drac in living in Cornwall if she was still around and living in Cornwall, because he would have been here. He would have been aboard here. He would probably be on her. Drac would probably have not gone into civil engineering. Drac would probably be the Ryan of Warspite. That is what we do talking about. I don't know who would be the Drac of YouTube, but he would be the Ryan of Warspite. And she deserved it. The history she tells. The story she gives. It's gorgeous. And it's such a loss. I mean, seriously, there are governments who have blood on their hands as far as historical heritage goes. And there are governments and nations which are so steeped in destroying their own historical heritage that, frankly, you wonder if they have any belief in the value of history at all, let alone the value of tourism and the value of anything other than the single amount of cost they read on a ledger. And the British government is one of those. The British government is absolutely, and before anyone starts going, it's a modern thing or anything, no. British governments have been destroying destroying heritage for a long, long time on the altar of it costs money. This is nothing new. It's one of the sad things that comes about the amount of times I have this conversation with people and I go, oh, it's new, it's because of this, it's because of this. No, it is nothing new. There is none of the favoured scapegoat policies things which people like to go, it's because of this today, or this, or easy point. No, they've just always been this way. They know the cost of everything, the value of nothing. Mainly because the people who would make the argument for value seem to be forgotten, or ignored, or kept out of the conversation. They're not even invited to it. And that's a problem. That truly is a problem. Warspite fought in so many battles. She had done so much history for the British. She would have been an illustration of World War One, of the interwar years, of World War Two, of the entire generation of British battleships. Of the fact that we haven't preserved a single battleship from that generation. There is not a single one. We have a C-class cruiser and we have HMS Belfast. That is it. Of the large ships of World War One and World War Two generation we have preserved. We have a destroyer. A single one. We have the world's largest navy. A navy which defined world history in that period and the period before it, and we have nothing to remember it by other than some pictures and some museum displays. We have none of the ships preserved. That is abuse of history. It truly is. Now, I wanted a sort of treaty-style battleship to be preserved, and I didn't want it to... I wanted it to be one of the... There are two types of sort of treaty ships, and there are lots of the American-style later treaty ships preserved, but there's... Washington treaty ships are just as rare. And so I picked Rodney, because Rodney's really the only Washington treaty battleship. Rodney and Nelson are. And Rodney was also involved in the sinking of Bismarck, and did all sorts of other things in World War II. So, honestly, she's a really cool ship to have been preserved. And the fact she wasn't, again, disturbs me. Let's put it this way. If they had preserved Warspite and then not preserved Rodney, I could understand that. If they haven't preserved Warspite, then why not preserve Rodney? She's in better condition, you can preserve her. Her hull's younger than Warspite's. It hasn't been worn by 2 world wars, it's just been worn by 1. You can keep that ship going as a museum ship. And again, I have no doubt that if she'd been preserved, the Ryan of Rodney would be Drac. It's just without a doubt. There are a few other potential options when it comes to Rodney, but I think Drac would probably win. He's got access to a large amount of sharp influence to make sure he wins. It helps in those tight discussions. But, again, I have to say that whilst the British government's crimes against its own history are mammoth, they aren't quite the worst here. No, the worst has to go to the US government. I am sorry. The worst has to go to the US government, because no one else on this list has dropped a nuclear bomb on their historical ship. The USS Saratoga. It would have given us a visible thing to wander through to look at early American battlecruiser design and battlecruiser design in that period. B, it would have given us an idea of given a great example of a conversion carrier. Excellent. Far better than HMS Furious for this role, because it's actually a decent conversion carrier. Furious she's good, but she's not as good, and there's all that trunking of funnel and smokestacks through her hangar and all sorts of weird things. Yeah, she really needs a lot of work, that ship, but she wasn't going to get it because she was going to be replaced. And C, there's the fact that she serves the whole way through World War II. She does all sorts of important missions, all sorts of important operations, all sorts of battles she takes part in, and she's really, really critical for. And then they nuke her. They nuke her just to test it out. They have all sorts of ships to choose from. They have, yes, Essex is coming out their ears, but some of those ships are in very bad state. And they choose to nuke the Saratoga. They have German prizes and Japanese ships to nuke. They do not need to... There is no justification, in my mind, for nuking the Saratoga rather than preserving her. That ship should have been preserved. The history that ship would bring alive. Just think about the people going to want to see her. I'm going to say, if she was still around, and what's coming next to this wasn't around, I would be pushing hard to be the equivalent of Ryan aboard her. I would quite literally have up sticks and be camping on her flight deck until they let me do so. She's that important. But no, they desecrate her. And you know what's worse? What's really, really, really bad is she has this done to her. She's stricken in 1946, and that's when they do it. And in the very next year, they do something arguably as bad for different reasons. They scrapped the Enterprise. She's decommissioned in 1947, and they don't actually fully start scrapping her till 1958, so she hangs around for 11 years. She's actually sitting on the pier side next to the Independence, which is the final Forrestal class, in this picture, waiting to be scrapped. She's scrapped between 1958 and 1960. They scrapped the Enterprise. It's just... the ship which symbolized the US Navy's war effort. The one of only three, along with Saratoga, that's 2 of 3 US carriers that actually start World War II and survive to the end. The third being the USS Ranger, which, whilst a good ship for a crew, not really a vessel you want surviving if you want to evaluate it, because it has so many issues as a carrier. But Enterprise, the Big E, Saratoga, and, well, she has various nicknames, but let's be honest, I don't think any of them really fitted her. Big E fits Enterprise, but Saratoga's what fits her. Calling him her sister Sarah or Sarah Maru doesn't really suit her. She's Saratoga. Nothing else needed. These ships, they are living history. And I would have given my right arm quite happily to have been the Ryan of them. They would be really useful piece of history to have. They would be really, you can imagine them festooned with aircraft from their era, all the eras they served in. You could imagine them the historical tours. You could imagine all the learning that would take place in them, all the knowledge. You can imagine the conferences you could hold them, because let's be honest, no one is going to resist the urge to hold a conference in the hangar of the USS Enterprise. Oh my lord, there would be historians and politicians beating each other to death with those fold-out chairs to get the chance to do that. Let alone bankers. Enterprise. Get it? And then you have this one. This is the one which would lead to an actual probable fight between me and Jamie Seedale. A physical fight over who would get to be the Ryan of her. No matter who was actually in post, he and I would take that person out and then be coming to blows over this role. Drag might go, but I would like to know. We have weight on you, we will crush you. This is out between us. Because, again, illustrious, this is the Battle of Taranto, this is the armoured carrier, this is the Royal Navy's... Marines not preserved a single carrier. Not a single one. And illustrious is in the British Pacific Fleet, she's in the Indian Ocean, she's in the Mediterranean, she's in the North Atlantic, she does all the different options. all the different areas she served in. The history. Again, the history. And of course, Taranto. Where, yes, the Royal Navy had got the Fleet Air Arm back, but Taranto is when the Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm truly gets to go, yes, we're here. And all its detractors have to listen. Yes, it had done Mirza al-Kabir before then, but that didn't really affect people because Mirza al-Kabir was a mucky one no one wanted to talk about. It was a necessary, distasteful act because Britain hadn't lost faith in the French Navy, but they'd lost faith in the French government. As I talked about before when I talked about Mirza al-Kabir. It's not a case of trusting the French Navy's words or the French... it's trusting the French government and the way the French had handled the whole situation about the fall of France had meant the British government had no faith in their word. And once you have no faith in their word, you've lost faith in anything to do with them. But illustrious is Taranto. Illustrious is Malta. Illustrious is so much history in World War II. It's honestly hard to sum it up. It's honestly hard to stick it into simple words. Yes, this ship should have been preserved. Picking a top 3 from this list is going to be a nightmare. It truly is. Because it doesn't end there. There is one more ship, and this is a very recent and very open wound. A very recent and very open wound. Hermes. Because she was in service with the Indian Navy until not that long ago. When we say not that long ago, she was scrapped in 2021. 3 years ago when this video comes out. She'd served with India from 1986 to 2021. Roughly 30 odd years. So 34-ish years. She's a Central class aircraft carrier. She'd been laid down in 1944, launched in 53, commissioned in 59, served in the Falklands War, served the whole way through the Cold War. For history of the last 20th century, since World War II. And considering Britain has no other carrier preserved, nothing else of its heritage. Yeah. This is pretty high up the list. Yes, there are French carriers and other ships which I would like to see preserved, but again, it's getting into my top 15, and there is a slight bias in my top 15, I must admit, but I am a British naval historian, so yeah, some of the British stories speak to me more than some of the others. I will admit all that quite happily in this scenario. But you have to think, Hermes, Cold War, Falklands War, World War II history. Yes, she hadn't served, but she's a Central class, so she's built for that period. All the service of India. Preserving this ship. Maybe it should have been preserved in India. Maybe it should have been preserved in Britain. I'm not sure. You can argue cases for both. You can argue the case that when it was sold, that was an absolute scandal by the government doing it at the time. And I would agree. Again, it's knowing the cost of everything, the value of nothing. But the simple fact is, she outlasted all the Invincible class. They were broken up in 2011, 2013, and 2017. In the case of Invincible, Ark Royal, and Illustrious. She outlasted them all. She saw so much history, and there were so many good preservation attempts made by both people in India and people in Britain to try and preserve her. There's even petition which goes to the Supreme Court of India, but that's stopped because 40% of the ship have been dismantled by the point at which the petition is agreed by the Supreme Court of India. So there are ships on this list which have been let down by a single government, a single nation. This ship is one which is let down by two. You can argue also Implacable you could say let down by two, because the French could have taken her and preserved her across the way. The British, I'm sure, considering the British sank her with both a British and a French flag flying, suggests that the British government at the time might have let them do that, but this one hurts. This one hurts bad. So, this is the last video in the pneumonia recovery schedule, before hopefully next week I get back to something approach the normal service. I'm not sure if key ships, key aircraft videos on Fridays will begin again, but I'm hoping to start the Thursday lives again. And that's, I've got 4 videos booked in, thanks to this. If I go all the way back to the beginning, I have got 4 topics next Thursdays booked in. And when this video goes live, the November vote should also be going live, if everything's worked as I've planned it to. Which means next Thursday we have David Beatty is put in command of the Battlecruiser Med Fleet instead of the Home Fleet before World War I. What happens? Having to work out that one. There are also some interesting alternate histories. We have canals, no more. How does the effect of either the Kiel, Suez, or Panama Canal not being built affect world events? That's an intriguing one. The Panama Canal is... The Two-Ocean Navy Act is something which the Americans have to consider a lot earlier. If you have no Panama Canal, if you find you cannot build the Panama Canal, for the USN, it becomes very problematic, because pretty much you have to run 2 entirely different separate fleets. An Atlantic Fleet and a Pacific Fleet. And that's going to be a problem, and it's going to mean that the Washington Naval Treaties certainly can't happen. Because there's no way you can have enough of a fleet to feel secure unless you either completely abandon the Atlantic or completely abandon the Pacific. And you can say you can completely abandon the Atlantic, but that means you basically have to form an alliance with with Britain, because you basically have to go Royal Navy, you have the Atlantic, and in almost America becomes kind of like France in that scenario. And then we have Fortress Heligoland. British doesn't give Heligoland back to Germans. Can Germany ever entertain its dreams of growth? Well, it can still grow as long as it maintains peace. Trying to take back Heligoland has been an interesting thing, but yeah. Tiger Cubs. RN replaces the armoured cruisers with 9.2-inch cruisers, constructed on the same time as similar as the Tiger battlecruiser. That's an interesting one, that the Royal Navy actually built some heavy cruisers prior to World War I. It's going to be an interesting one to talk about. But yeah, that's what we've got coming up now. And with that in mind, I will be honest and say that if I was doing this as a personal thing, rather than a professional thing, as it's saying of which 3 ships I preserve, I'd be in just as much a bind. Because I'd be deciding between Tartar, Ashante, Nubian, and Eskimo. And all 4 of those ships deserve to survive. So if you're making me pick 3 out of 4, that's meaning I have to sacrifice one of my babies. And this is before we get on to the battles, of which none of them survive. There is at least Haida surviving to represent the tribals, and there is Vampire surviving to represent the Daring. So I suppose that's good, but there is no battle surviving. It would be cruelty. So, in many ways, it's good that I'm not allowed to include these ships in discussions, because it has made my life a little bit less painful. Because Could you really sacrifice what is arguably one of the most decorated ship in Royal Navy history, or should be the most decorated ship in Royal Navy history? Because if destroyer battles were judged like battleship battles, i.e., they just had to turn up and fight the enemy, and it's a battle award, this would probably have more battle honors than HMS Warspite. Could you really judge against a vessel which literally sacrificed bows, not a bow singular, but bows, in the service of its country? How about the vessel which magically goes through World War II doing all these really high-risk missions, but managed to survive significant damage, avoid getting significant damage? Let's be honest, though, if this one still survived, there is a good argument she should be sitting in the Gold Coast. She should be sitting with the Asante people, who took huge pride in her when she was commissioned. And they did a huge ceremony for her, and they gave all sorts of prizes, etc., and things to her crew. That kept her safe. And then this HMS Tata. And the weird stuff she gets up to during World War II. There is an entire special operations executive which is literally using her to go and surveil operations and landings to try and work out how to do operations and landings. It's not SOE as in the true SOE, it's an entire sort of executive unit which is literally focused on amphibious warfare. And the amount of officers... I'm fairly certain, from the description of them, the major who was aboard her was significantly more than a major, because majors aren't usually described as that age, and significantly more senior. But the cover was they were a major when they went aboard her, and all sorts of things. It's an interesting time, that ship. But yes, that's not answering today's question. Today's question is... pick three. Pick three. I have to pick one of the carriers. There has to be one of the carriers. I can't let it not be one of the carriers be picked, and it's a hard one. It truly is. For me, it comes down to two of them, which are to make it harder. As much as I'd love to have Hermes in the Hermes, my PhD thesis was on the carrier development leading up to World War II. It's got to be Saratoga or Illustrious. It's got to be those two, one of those two, and because the Americans have other carriers, the Americans do have other carriers. It's going to be Illustrious. Literally, that is one of my ship saves, Illustrious, literally because, and the only differential in my mind between her and Saratoga on their value to preserved historically is the Americans have other carriers. They do have some preserved carriers, whereas Britain don't have any. And then, in this section, really, you're picking between Gloire, Devastation, Tiger, Warspite, and Rodney. And honestly, I would have to say for me, I'd love a Washington Treaty era ship to survive. Again, because of the treaty's history, so I'd love it to be Rodney. And then Warspite has her own history and a plot picked out. And Devastation is just such a cool piece of history, and Gloire, as said, it'd really be useful to show it as a really great illustration to to French children and French, the French wider culture, how interesting their naval history is. But honestly, I'm going with Tiger. I'm going with Tiger because I'd like a battlecruiser to be preserved. I really would. And if I'm not saying Saratoga, which is built on a battlecruiser hull, this has got to be it. This has got to be it. There's got to be a battlecruiser preserved. And so that's Tiger. For me. She'd be a good ship to have around. She'd be a really good piece of history. I could see her sitting in Portsmouth. I would love to actually see a picture of this at Portsmouth Harbour of her sitting next to Victory. Her, Victory, and Warrior in a line. That would be something... Oh, that'd be gorgeous. Mary Rose there as well, and you just think of the history there. Think of it, and little M11 sitting in there going, "Hello, I'm here too," and you just have all this history. That'd be just, oh, it'd be gorgeous. You would never get Drac out of there. You'd never get me out of there, honestly. There is a good number of people I can think about in naval history terms who are popular naval historians who would never leave that museum. They would literally be trapped in there. There would be no escape. Just so much history to go and see and talk about and discuss. It would just be I don't know, it would be like a cosmic black hole sucking in all the naval historians from Britain. Let me leave these ships. Carcass, Implacable, Great Michael, Turtle ships, and Treasure Fleet, and the Quinker Marines. Oh my. That is a hard one. Look, for both of these, and in these three, it's not a specific ship. It's, I would like some examples to survive. So we could end the debate and move the debate on to more interesting things about them. That sort of rules them out. As much as I would love them to, that sort of rules them out. So that means it'd be between the Great Michael, Implacable, and Caracas. For me, it's got to be Implacable. I'd love it to be the Great Michael, I really would, and Carcass is just such a cool story, a cool piece of history. But it's got to be the Implacable, because it survived till 1949. 1949! Do you know what I find worse? By World War II, she is called HMS Forderent, and she is used as a training establishment and accommodation for sea cadets and signalling in the Royal Navy. And in 1943, there's a photo of her in 1943 flying the England Expects flag signal, as she's a ship which had survived Trafalgar. And she was the only vessel still afloat which had fought at Trafalgar. And they knew this. They knew this history about her, and they still sank her in 1949. It's just... It's historically so much vandalism. So yes. My three saved are Implacable, Tiger, and Illustrious. Illustrious because the Americans have carriers around, but Saratoga would certainly be in there if it wasn't. Tiger because, as much as I'd love it to be Renown and Repulse, Tiger has... Repulse is sunk, Hood is sunk, and Hood wouldn't be in there anyway from my perspective. So it's got to be between Tiger and Renown for me as the two longest serving battle cruisers. So let's be honest, the German ones are gone by that point, and Tiger just about steals it for me because of her service in World War I and because of all the stuff she gets up to, and because she's in many ways a battle cruiser rather than a battle cruiser which has been modified a bit. She's more of the idea, sort of the Royal Navy's battle cruiser. She's a larger ship as well for history purposes. That's always good for visiting. And then Implacable is also known as the Duguay-Trouin, so she's a French-built ship. She's a third rate. She's the last surviving example of the third rates, and she's sunk in 1949. Just scuttled in 1949. She survived 2 world wars. Yes, it would have cost money, but there are some absolutely gorgeous photographs from her, and I would just like to be able to go aboard her and see the history. So yes, those are my 3 ships if I'm being strictly professional. And yes, I do realise at least one of the 2 of those ships would probably lead to me actually having. Well, actually, all 3 of those ships could lead to me. Well, no, two of those ships, Tiger and Illustrious, could both lead to me having physical fights with 2 of my dearest naval history colleagues. But I'd probably survive. I'd probably be okay to try and be the equivalent to Ryan from USS New Jersey on them. But we'll leave that to one side. That's a bit of interesting history. If you haven't seen his videos, Ryan's or Drakenafel's videos, or Jamie C. Delvama Carrier's videos, you won't really know why I'm talking about them like this, but please go look at them. And yeah, hopefully the myself, Jamie C. and Drac will get back to recording Build Trump soon together. We keep meaning to start recording again. But of course, if I had all the money in the world and the time travelling system, I would of course travel back in time and buy Tartar, Eskimo, Ashanti and Nubian off the British government and make a whole museum around the 4 of them and their career and their service, because I think that would be beautiful. And I would have bought 4 more battles as well, when they did, and 4 darings as well, and I'd have my little 12 destroyer flotilla museum. And it would be a beautiful museum. And maybe I'd actually allow other people in to come see them, or maybe I'd just wander around on my own. No, I would. I'm very big in believing that history is meant to be shared and lessons are meant to be passed on. But yeah, 1 day a week I probably would keep it closed just for me to wander around on my own. Let's be honest, if I've paid for it all, then nicest way, I'm allowed 1 day a week where I can shut everyone else in the world out and just wander around going, what can I learn today? This does lead me to my long-term dream, and one of the reasons why I pay so much attention to virtual reality and working in virtual reality space, and I play around with various virtual reality avatars and software now to try and work on it, is I would love to build a virtual reality walkthrough of these ships, because that's the closest I can get to having these ships rebuilt, probably and sensibly, is setting up a VR system where people can wander through them. And that's going to take time, money, and understanding, and is an ongoing effort of mine. It's one of the reasons why I buy so many books. Find more pictures, find more accounts, make sure I can be precise about things, and there's a whole list of ships I would love to turn into it. It's an area which I will get to hopefully someday. It's something I will get to do someday. But it's a project a long way off. But that's why I'm writing books and I think as much as I can now. So if I can't build a VR scape for people to wander around, I can hopefully give them imagery in their minds that they can wander around it in their heads, in their dreams. It's an aim. It's a goal. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. As mentioned a couple of times, currently, everything's funded by you, and currently the funding is going on a huge number of Calyxes and other things, which are there's probably going to need another. I think I might have underestimated how many I needed again. Oh, we'll see.
I'll build this at some point today, probably when this goes. This probably. Oh, maybe I'll build it when this video goes live. I'm not sure. And I'll try and get some more boxes unpacked. We'll see what we can do. Moving house is fun. Moving house is expensive, but I have got a far larger space. Once I've got all the boxes in here sorted out and the things sorted down here, I will have a lot more space for doing history stuff. And I've got plans for a green screen. I've got plans for doing all sorts of things with perhaps even some motion capture at some point to try and do that VR stuff. Or at least start down that VR road. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and what have we got coming up next week? Next week is conception, operation, conclusion of the Kuznetsov class, aka the Polisi class. They're going to be an interesting thing to discuss. They really are. And then we got Soviet naval aviation the week after that, so I better make sure all those books are out, because I've got to check that before I record it. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care.